Oi, you silly guys! Bitcoin was just a bubble. There'll never actually be a stable market established in the counter economy. Even if it does happen, it's not really anonymous because the state is omnipotent and can apparently defy the laws of reality and decrypt encrypted hardware. But despite having this ability, their security backdoors on their official websites can be hacked by children demonstrating in front of live audiences. The state has nothing to worry about, you filthy little peasants. Go back to being tax cattle. No, what are you doing? Stop trying to trade around us. You're supposed to sit there and take it when we rob you of everything you own, destroy your society, and rob you of your dignity. We can't track cryptocurrencies. That means we can't ban them. Please stop trading in cryptocurrencies. We'll give you 6 gorillion shekels that we stole from others.
So, be honest with me. Could you actually name something more satisfying in this world than watching a bunch of power-hungry tyrants fucking eat it after a long period of time where they were directly making everyone's lives miserable by holding dominion over them and imposing their will onto them through violent coercion? And especially when they're cocky enough to actually bullshit themselves into believing that they'll always be doing this. And that's actually what's happening right now with the state. For those of you who are unfamiliar or haven't seen my numerous videos explaining agorism, or what I believe the best method is of achieving political change, cryptocurrency since 2008 has been making governments of the world absolutely terrified, and rightfully so, with blockchains, peer-to-peer decentralized encryption making exchange completely untraceable and therefore impossible to regulate, more importantly, impossible to tax. This being the case, it's inevitable that counter-economies will begin to form around decentralized means of exchange like cryptocurrency and compete with the state using gray and black markets. And in 2017, after the incredibly sharp rise in Bitcoin, this put the state officially on edge because they know that their time is up due to a growing demand for decentralization. Naturally, being completely unable to regulate trade, they will quickly lose control over their market, since they rely on appropriating resources, and they won't be able to appropriate resources because the state has no idea how much money you have in cryptocurrency, nor do they have any idea what you actually own if you buy something with it. And it's already been demonstrated that if they outlaw it, it won't dissuade people from trading in it, since it's more profitable than fiat currency, with regulations and other costly state intervention not being taken into consideration either. And because people know that it can't be traced back to them, so they know that the state won't do anything to them. And this could be no better exemplified than what's both happening to Greece and Australia, and what their governments have done in response, or at least what they claim is in response to a growing counter-economy within their countries. In Greece's case, their counter-economy now takes up 1/4 of their nation's entire economic output. But before we go over the reaction to growing counter-economies from the state, let's go over the reaction from the media. Governments, knowing that they can't just outlaw it and intimidate people with threats into not using it, have been utilizing their controlled media outlets to push various narratives in order to attempt to scare people away from these counter-markets by fooling them into thinking one of two things. One, that it's not as secure as they think, and 2, that it's not as profitable as they think. A strategy which, as I've pointed out, is really not working, since when it comes to the profit motive, i.e. why people trade in any sort of markets in the fucking first place, propaganda and political fear-mongering will not dissuade people, since generally the people trading don't have any political allegiances and simply just want to better their own lives. And they're also failing because the media pundits have no fucking idea what they're talking about. Because it is the state we're talking about here, after all. What, you expect some competence from them all of a sudden? And anyone who actually researches how cryptocurrency works and studies the markets, the actual counter-economists that they're trying to persuade, know as a matter of fact that the media doesn't know what they're talking about because they trade with it for a living. So even at its conception, this is just a really dumb idea, and all it does is show us how desperate the state is and give us some hot takes to laugh at.
Look at one of the main functions of government is to create currency. And Bitcoin is successful only because of its potential for circumvention, lack of oversight. So it seems to me it ought to be outlawed. It doesn't serve any socially useful function. We ought to just go back to what we always have had, and this is just a bubble, as several of your commentators have already pointed out. It's a bubble that's going to give a lot of people a lot of exciting times as it rises up and then goes down. But
this is away from your Nobel Prize, and it's away from your acclaim in economics, but I'm going to go there anyways. Charles Mackay, 1841. Talks about our peculiar follies in the behavioral component that makes for these bubbles, whether it's 1637 and tulip bulbs, 1840 rose. Bring up the chart here. Here's the bubble in the making. This is log Bitcoin. I can't stand the arithmetic charts. And this is all you need to know. This is massive convexity. I haven't seen that chart since the tulip bulbs when we were doing surveillance by semaphore. Professor Stiglitz, they're relying on a Marxist theory of value. They're going back to middle Marx and looking at the value of exchange. It's smoke and mirrors, isn't it?
I mean, if you gave me some of these quotes out of context and told me that they were initially from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I would totally believe you. I mean, who could forget all of Marx's writings on marginalism? We all know how inspired von Mises was by Karl Marx when he wrote his Theory of Money and Credit. Now, by far the most common claims made by these media shills about Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency consist of two things, which you saw both of in that previous clip: that it has no value, and any growth it experiences is simply the result of a bubble. Well, if they actually knew what they were talking about when it came to cryptocurrency and money in general, they'd know that the value of any currency comes from its supply and demand. In other words, the scarcity of it and its utility, because money, like everything else, is a commodity. The difference between money and any other commodity is that in order for a commodity to become a money, no one worries about its commodity value, and it's merely a means of exchange between commodities with less utility. And in order for it to reach that point, it has to have a very specific set of characteristics which give it so much utility that virtually everyone will have a use for it as simply a means of trade. At this point, it's no longer a commodity in the traditional sense of the word, and it's simply used as a middle point in between exchanges of human actors. This is commonly misconstrued by mainstream economists and media pundits as money only having value because
people agree that it has value.
However, if this was the case, hyperinflation would never occur. Also, there has never been a single documented currency in history that didn't initially start as a preferred medium of exchange, with all of the hallmarks previously noted that make a commodity a currency. Otherwise, the commodity in question can never become a currency because you'd run into a problem known as the double coincidence of wants. You'd have a bunch of people with commodities that they're more than happy to trade, but no one with any means of exchange that the sellers are willing to part with their produce for. If I'm growing tomatoes and you want my tomatoes but could only give me a chicken, some other people may be happy to trade with you, but I and many others don't want a chicken. But something 100% of human actors can identify with is something which they can create value with, and something which they can use to create a better living situation for themselves, which is why commodities with the previously noted characteristics of a currency become money. As for cryptocurrencies being bubbles, this one is just fucking stupid. Any politician or media pundit you find, if they even explain why they claim it's a bubble, they will only be able to point to the fact that cryptocurrencies experience parabolic rises. In other words, they are literally saying that any extended period of growth within a market is a bubble, which No, that's not what a bubble is. A bubble is a trend in any given market where asset prices rise due to an increasing investment rate, but savings rates are incredibly low, so investors don't receive a return on their investments and producers stop profiting by selling their commodities at the market's rate. So the market's rate drops because investors and producers begin to sell off all their assets. This is not what happened to Bitcoin, as there was never a point in its rise where there was a high rate of investment with a low rate of savings. In fact, the growth in demand for Bitcoin was very real, and there was and still is a very active market for it. What happened here is that Bitcoin has a problem with scalability. I'm sure we're all familiar with how the blockchain works. Each exchange is its own block on the blockchain with its own written values into it, and each time a new block is added onto the blockchain, a receiver node is sent from your coin wallet, which reduces your balance by the amount you exchanged with, or increases it, vice versa. Bitcoin's network is limited by an average block creation time of 10 minutes and was programmed with a size limit for each block, which complicates the network's throughput. This increases the network's transaction fees and delays the processing of transactions as more people actively trade in Bitcoin, which is a big problem because this dissuades people from trading with Bitcoin as the network becomes more active. And if people aren't actively trading with it, it loses demand, which means it will drop in value. To put it simply, Bitcoin has a fundamental problem with its network which prevents it from ever sustaining growth beyond a certain level of demand, and any short-term growth will inevitably experience a regression to the mean, which is what happened in January. This, however, is not a problem with cryptocurrency itself, only with how Bitcoin was designed. Litecoin and Dash, for example, don't have this problem with scalability and therefore won't bottleneck like Bitcoin did once the demand gets high enough for an active market. Now, on to the next point statists make, that cryptocurrency isn't truly anonymous, or rather just try and scare people with, because they very rarely make an argument for this point, rather they just assert it without reasoning because everything else they've known operates like this, so truly this has to operate like this too. I mean, a basic understanding of cryptography dictates that this isn't the case, and it's mathematically impossible to decrypt an encrypted file without an encryption key because all cryptography is based on what is referred to as non-polynomial time, or an NP problem. Cryptography has code which is based on math that produces a certain input which has to be figured out for an encrypted file to be opened. This figure becomes exponentially larger with time and activity, and consequently becomes increasingly more difficult to solve the problem. As a code breaker, you're essentially stuck trying to choose two prime-digit numbers out of a random value which has an infinitely expanding number of digits and is so complex that computers and mathematicians can't make heads or tails of what its prime values could have been in the first place. The closest I've seen to any piece explaining their reasoning is Vox's on black markets and gun control, and this is just pure propaganda. This is dishonest misinformation which was purely designed to try and scare people away from using cryptocurrency, and it's pretty fucking disgusting.
What is Bitcoin?
It's a technology that enables people to move money around anonymously.
It's harder to trace and it's so anonymous.
100% untraceable.
People like to think that Bitcoin is anonymous.
Good afternoon.
But buried in last month's special counsel indictment of 12 alleged Russian spies is an explanation of how law enforcement tracked and identified the suspects using their cryptocurrency transactions.
We'll get back to this in a moment, because if I explained what they're doing wrong and how this is a dishonest mischaracterization of how they obtained this info without them getting to it, it wouldn't make much sense. But please, Vice, explain to us how your journalists and the state have managed to defy the laws of mathematics by figuring out how definitively to obtain a prime value from a number which infinitely expands and has no definitive start to begin with.
One blockchain developer was also able to trace Bitcoin purchases back to Russia's intelligence agency, the GRU, using only public information.
Oh, of course, those fucking Ruskies used Bitcoin to rig the 2016 election. I should have guessed. I mean, that doesn't even make sense. How do you hack into a voting machine and change votes with a currency? So now you're not only defying the laws of mathematics with your claims, but you're explaining how you did so by citing a narrative that's been debunked thoroughly. You haven't even explained how you got to your conclusion, and everyone already can tell it's bullshit. Alright, I'll shut up now. This is just too funny.
He agreed to show Vice News how almost anyone with a Bitcoin wallet could do something similar.
It is not a good idea to commit crime with Bitcoin, because the moment you have one single weak link in your operational security, all of your history is now exposed.
This guy is a blockchain developer. Based on what he's about to say, I sincerely doubt that. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and check that real quick. Nope, just as I suspected, he's a political activist who runs a small blog that advocates for government regulation of cryptocurrency. He's also written a few articles about Bitcoin which assert that Bitcoin doesn't have value because it doesn't have intrinsic value. In other words, this buffoon doesn't even understand supply and demand because he thinks that commodities all have one universal objective value which is unquestionable. This man isn't a blockchain developer. He doesn't know the first thing about cryptocurrency, he doesn't know the first thing about cryptography, and he doesn't even understand economics. This is just some random soy-filled vagina Vice found who is willing to act like an authority on the subject, talk with a smug look on his face for a few minutes while he bullshits his way through whatever narrative they wanted him to run with.
As we've seen in case after case, indictment after indictment, where they're shutting down drug trading, exchanges that are operating illegally, it's not just traceable, it's trivial to trace these things.
The Russian agents working on behalf of the GRU used Bitcoin as part of the Mueller investigation.
Exactly, as part of the Mueller investigation. It lists out several counts. Count 10 very specifically talks about how these Russian operatives from the GRU used Bitcoin, amongst other cryptocurrencies, to buy services needed to perform the alleged hacking. There was a very specific call out for a certain transaction amount that occurred on a specific date. And when you went back into the blockchain and looked at it, you can literally say, all right, there was a transaction for 0.026043 Bitcoin. That's a very specific number, right?
So you're saying that because you looked in the indictment and saw the exact amount of Bitcoin that they used, that Russian agent was the only one to spend that exact amount of Bitcoin in that 24-hour period.
So no, you can't actually trace transactions through a blockchain unless you know their wallet ID, the exact amount they traded with, and the day they traded it. And the only way you could obtain that information is if you were told, which even if someone did give you a date, time, and wallet ID, there's no way that you could confirm that it's the person in question who owns the wallet. For all the court knows, the police could have just been looking through active transactions and picked a random one they just happened to see. All this proves is that you can show a transaction occurred, which everyone already knew. Way to make yourself look like a complete fucking idiot, Tim. I can't tell which one's dumber here. Tim for what he's just tried to argue, or Vice for demonstrably lying over such a trivial piece of information, just to appeal to authority with an argument that every crypto enthusiast would have seen through immediately anyways. As pointed out, various governments already have laws that attempt to stop the trade of cryptocurrency, China and Russia being the most prominent examples since they have the largest economies out of the countries that have done this, and it was outright banned in both countries. But that was in 2015, and since then, China has $1.7 billion worth of exchanges occurring in cryptocurrencies every single day. And there are entire cities which trade with cryptocurrency in Russia. On top of that, some of their larger metropolitan areas like Moscow trade $50 million worth of Bitcoin and Ethereum by volume on a daily basis. This has consequently scared a lot of governments in the Western Hemisphere, rightfully so, and they're reacting predictably. The politicians know they've lost, and that it's only a matter of time before actors in these giant agoras begin filling the place for every fundamental pillar of society that the government currently claims that only they could do, and doing so much more efficiently than the state can with a much better quality of service at a much lower price. So, like the spoiled, rotten brats that they are, just being told that they've been grounded, the state is now letting out what final steam it has left with what amounts to be an insignificant but destructive temper tantrum. The two governments in question so far are Greece and Australia. Greece is now flying government-piloted drones off their coastlines because for some reason they think that recording people on their boats will allow them to monitor and trace cryptocurrency transactions. Don't even ask me to explain their reasoning behind that because they didn't attempt to themselves. And Australia has quite controversially written a new law with the specific intention of combating encryption called the Assistance and Access Bill of 2018. This allows the government, for any reason that they want, to get a warrant and install any hardware on your computer that they want. And yes, that wouldn't really do anything to stop the exchange of cryptocurrency and wouldn't allow them any more oversight over encrypted programs that they already have. And it's a pretty popular criticism, even among Australian politicians, that this bill's new laws don't have anything to do with encryption. But hey, this wouldn't be the first time that Australia's government has made it their official position to be overtly ignorant of mathematical truisms in favor of political decrees. So, yeah, in case you haven't caught on, the state knows full well what they're doing right now doesn't have anything to do with encryption and counter-economics. What we're seeing is simply the last and dying gasp of the political system. The state is being innovated out of existence, and because of the decentralized and encrypted counter-economy, we are entering a world where it's not actually possible for the state to form again. The most beautiful thing is that everything they do at this point will only make the counter-economy expand. It's like one of those Chinese finger traps. The more you struggle, the tighter it gets. Increase the violations on our privacy? Oh, people don't like that, so they'll just innovate the means that you're doing that out of existence through open source development cycles and create an encrypted, decentralized alternative due to the demand for it. Going to increase the tax rate so the state can try and sustain itself? Oh, you'll just start losing more people to the counter-economy who were willing to put up with paying taxes, but no longer are because it's becoming impossible for them to profit off of the state market, so they move to the counter market to maximize their profits. You've lost politicians and corporatists, game over. You can shape your reality around this now because your fucking chickens have come home to roost. It would be great if you would be like the Russian government, just roll over and accept it like they have by letting people exchange crypto from their government banks. And it really is just the most incredible feeling that for the last 5,500 years, people have been tyrannized by governments to varying degrees. That is countless generations that have lived their entire lives never even having a concept of what actual freedom felt like or would be like. Then to think that out of all this time, it looks like this is going to be the generation which finally sees the state come to an end.